On the morning of November 14, 2004, the USS Nimitz carrier strike group was operating in the Pacific Ocean during a scheduled training exercise. The group included the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, the guided missile cruiser USS Princeton, and several supporting vessels. All units were conducting routine operations. There were no active alerts. Flight operations aboard the USS Nimitz were proceeding as planned. Fighter aircraft were being prepared for training missions. Pilots were briefed on standard objectives related to air combat practice and coordination with ship-based radar systems. No unusual instructions were given. On the USS Princeton, radar operators were on duty, monitoring the surrounding airspace. The area of operation was controlled. Commercial air traffic was not present. Only military aircraft associated with the exercise were expected to appear on radar. Weather conditions were stable. Visibility was clear. Sea conditions were calm enough to support uninterrupted flight operations. At this stage, all systems were functioning normally. Radar returns matched expected aircraft positions. Communications between ships and aircraft were routine. No system malfunctions were reported. No unidentified contacts had been logged. The operational status of the strike group remained normal. At approximately mid-morning, while radar monitoring continued as usual, a contact appeared on the USS Princeton's radar display that did not match any scheduled aircraft, known transponder signal, or expected flight profile. At the moment it first appeared, the contact was treated as a routine anomaly. No immediate action was taken. The object was not yet classified as a threat, nor was it assigned priority status. This radar contact marked the first recorded indication of the event that would unfold over the course of that day. The exercise continued. Monitoring continued, and the contact remained on the screen. The radar contact was first noticed by operators aboard the USS Princeton during routine airspace monitoring. The Princeton was equipped with the N/Spy 1 radar system, a highly sensitive phased array radar designed to detect and track aircraft at long range and high altitude. During training exercises, this system continuously scanned the surrounding airspace and displayed all detected contacts on operator consoles. When the contact initially appeared, it registered at an altitude of approximately 80,000 feet. This altitude immediately stood out. It was significantly higher than the operating ceiling of most military aircraft involved in the exercise, and well above the altitude of commercial air traffic, which was not present in the area at the time. The contact did not broadcast a transponder signal. No identification code was associated with it. It did not match any scheduled flight plan, friendly aircraft designation, or known military platform operating in the region. Radar operators followed standard procedure. First, they observed the contact over multiple radar sweeps to confirm it was not a transient return. The object remained visible. It did not fade or disappear as false radar echoes sometimes do. Next, the operators checked the system for possible errors. Diagnostic checks were performed. The radar system continued to function normally. No faults were detected. Shortly after the initial detection, the radar data showed a second unusual characteristic. The contact's altitude changed rapidly. According to radar readings, the object descended from high altitude to much lower altitude in a very short time, without showing a gradual descent profile. The movement did not resemble the controlled descent of an aircraft or the falling trajectory of debris. The contact then appeared again at higher altitude. This pattern repeated. During this time, the object did not maintain a steady speed. It did not follow a predictable flight path. It did not behave like known fixed-wing or rotary aircraft. Radar operators continued to log the data. They compared readings across multiple radar displays and tracking modes. The behavior remained consistent across systems. At this point, the contact was still not considered a direct threat. No evasive actions were ordered. No emergency procedures were initiated. The information was relayed up the chain of command as an unidentified radar contact exhibiting unusual altitude changes. The initial assessment remained cautious. Possible explanations such as sensor interference or atmospheric effects were considered, but no determination was made. The contact continued to appear on radar, and as monitoring continued, it became clear that the object was not a single isolated return. Additional similar contacts were detected in the same general area, displaying comparable behavior. By this point, the radar operators understood that what they were observing could not be dismissed as a momentary anomaly. The situation remained controlled. The exercise continued, but the unidentified contacts were now being watched closely. This escalation in attention would soon lead to a decision to investigate the contacts visually. As the unidentified radar contacts continued to appear, attention aboard the USS Princeton increased. Radar operators had now observed the objects over multiple sweeps and across different tracking modes. The data was consistent. The contacts were not behaving like known aircraft, and they were not disappearing as temporary radar anomalies typically do. The information was passed to senior officers aboard the Princeton. At this stage, there was still no indication of hostile intent. The objects were not approaching the carrier group directly. They were not transmitting signals. They were not matching the speed or altitude profiles of known threats. However, their behavior remained unexplained. The radar data showed the contacts changing altitude rapidly, appearing at high altitude, and then at much lower levels without a visible transition. This was unusual enough to warrant further attention, even in the absence of an immediate threat. Command personnel reviewed the situation. Standard procedure required determining whether the contacts posed a risk to ongoing flight operations. With multiple training flights scheduled, unidentified objects in controlled airspace could not be ignored indefinitely. The decision was made to gather more information. Rather than escalating the situation, Command chose a controlled response. A visual identification would provide clarity. Fighter aircraft already scheduled for training flights could be redirected without disrupting operations. This approach followed established protocol. Visual confirmation is often the fastest way to resolve unknown radar contacts, especially when electronic data alone does not provide answers. On board the USS Nimitz, pilots were notified of a change to their flight tasking. The instruction was brief and direct. They were told that radar had detected unidentified contacts in the training area and that they were to proceed to the assigned coordinates to attempt visual identification. No assumptions were given about what the objects might be. There was no sense of urgency in the communication. The tone remained routine. The pilots acknowledged the instruction and prepared to launch. At this moment, the situation was still being treated as an airspace management issue, not an encounter. The radar contacts were real. Their behavior was unusual. And now, the responsibility to observe them directly was being transferred from radar screens to pilots in the air. The aircraft were cleared for launch. 2 F/A-18 Super Hornet fighter jets were selected to investigate the unidentified radar contacts. The aircraft were already scheduled for a routine training mission, which allowed the tasking to proceed without delay. The pilots were Commander David Fravor and Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich. Both were experienced naval aviators. They received coordinates based on radar tracking from the USS Princeton and were instructed to proceed to the area for visual identification. The jets launched from the USS Nimitz without incident. Once airborne, the pilots climbed to their assigned altitude and followed the guidance provided by radar controllers. Communication between the aircraft and the ships remained steady and professional. There were no emergency calls and no changes to standard procedures. As the pilots approached the designated area, they were informed that the radar contacts appeared to be descending. The pilots adjusted their course. From the air, the ocean below appeared calm. Weather conditions were clear. Visibility was unobstructed. There were no clouds interfering with sight lines. As they reached the general location of the radar contact, the pilots observed something unusual on the surface of the water. Below them, the ocean appeared to be disturbed, as if something large were just beneath the surface. The disturbance was localized, circular, and did not resemble the wake of a known vessel or submarine. Above this area, one of the pilots noticed an object in the air. The object was described as white, smooth, and oblong in shape. It had no visible wings, no tail, and no exhaust plume. Its size was estimated to be approximately 40 feet in length. The object appeared to be hovering. It was not rotating. It was not emitting sound. It showed no visible means of propulsion. The pilots maintained visual contact and began maneuvering to get a closer look. At this point, the object's movement changed. Rather than remaining stationary, it began to move in response to the aircraft. As the lead jet descended, the object also adjusted its position, staying above the disturbed area of the ocean. The movement was controlled and deliberate. The pilots reported what they were seeing over the radio. Their descriptions were calm and precise. No conclusions were offered. Only observable details were communicated. Radar controllers continued to track the situation, though the object's behavior made consistent radar lock difficult. The encounter was no longer limited to radar data. The object was now being observed directly, and it was responding to the presence of the aircraft. After establishing visual contact, the pilots began a controlled intercept maneuver. Commander Fravor, flying the lead aircraft, descended toward the object while maintaining a safe distance. The intention was not to engage, but to observe. Standard intercept procedures were followed. Speed, altitude, and angle were adjusted gradually. As the aircraft descended, the object's behavior became more unusual. The white object did not remain fixed in position. Instead, it appeared to react to the aircraft's movement. When the jet turned, the object turned. When the jet descended, the object adjusted its position accordingly. There was no visible delay. The pilots did not observe any control surfaces on the object. There were no wings changing angle, no exhaust trails, and no heat distortion. Despite this, the object maneuvered with precision. The distance between the aircraft and the object decreased. At one point, the object began moving laterally across the disturbed patch of ocean water. Its movement was smooth and rapid, without signs of inertia typically associated with aircraft. The pilots attempted to position themselves above and slightly behind the object to gain a clearer view. As they did, the object accelerated. The acceleration was sudden. According to the pilots' reports, the object moved away from the aircraft at a speed that exceeded the jet's ability to follow. There was no visible build-up to this movement. It did not gradually increase speed. It simply moved. Within seconds, the object was no longer visible. The pilots searched the surrounding airspace. There was no debris, no splash in the water, no indication of where the object had gone. Radio communication resumed immediately. The pilots reported the loss of visual contact and described the object's final movement. Their tone remained steady. The report focused on what was observed, not on speculation. Radar operators attempted to reacquire the contact. For a brief moment, the object appeared again on radar, not near its last observed position, but at a location significantly distant from where the aircraft had been operating. This suggested that the object had relocated rapidly. At this stage, the intercept attempt had ended. The pilots had approached the object, observed its behavior, and witnessed its departure. There was nothing further they could do without new guidance. They were instructed to continue monitoring the area and await further instructions. The encounter had lasted only a few minutes, but the data collected during that time would become central to everything that followed. After the object disappeared from visual range, attention shifted back to the radar systems aboard the USS Princeton. Radar operators attempted to reacquire the contact near the last known position of the object. No return was detected in that area. The airspace immediately surrounding the pilot's location appeared clear. Moments later, a radar contact appeared again. This time, it was detected at a location tens of miles away from where the object had last been observed visually. The contact appeared suddenly, without a track showing how it traveled between the two positions. The altitude associated with this new radar return was consistent with previous detections. Once again, the object appeared at a high altitude and then exhibited rapid changes in vertical position. Radar operators verified the data. Multiple radar displays showed the same return. Tracking modes were switched. Filters were adjusted. The contact remained visible. The timing of the radar reacquisition was noted. It occurred shortly after the pilots reported the objects. Sudden acceleration and loss of visual contact. The correlation between the two events was recorded. The pilots were informed of the new radar position. Given the distance between the aircraft and the newly detected contact, an immediate intercept was not possible with the fuel and time available. The pilots were instructed to maintain their current position and continue to monitor the area visually. No further visual contact was made during this phase. Radar tracking continued intermittently. The object did not maintain a stable flight path. It appeared, disappeared, and reappeared at different altitudes and positions over a short period of time. Despite this activity, the object did not approach the carrier group. It did not enter restricted zones near the ships. It did not display behavior consistent with surveillance or attack. The situation remained controlled. Command personnel reviewed the incoming data. The object's behavior was now confirmed by both visual observation and radar tracking. This combination elevated the significance of the event, even though no immediate threat was identified. At this point, a decision was made to attempt further documentation. Another aircraft, equipped with additional sensor capabilities, would be tasked to observe the object if it appeared again. The focus shifted from interception to recording. The goal was no longer to approach the object directly, but to capture measurable data that could be reviewed later. With the initial intercept concluded, preparations began for a second flight. The event was still ongoing, and the unidentified contact had not yet left the operational area. Following the radar reacquisition, Command determined that additional sensor data was needed. A second pair of F/A-18 Super Hornets was prepared for launch from the USS Nimitz. These aircraft were equipped with advanced targeting forward-looking infrared (FLIR) systems capable of recording infrared imagery and tracking aerial targets beyond visual range. The objective of this launch was different from the first. The pilots were not instructed to intercept aggressively or close distance. Their task was to observe, track, and record if the unidentified contact appeared again within sensor range. The aircraft launched without incident and proceeded toward the area indicated by radar. Coordination between the USS Princeton and the airborne pilots continued through standard communication channels. As the aircraft approached the designated airspace, radar controllers reported intermittent contacts consistent with earlier observations. The object appeared briefly, then dropped out of radar coverage, then reappeared again. The pilots activated their infrared targeting systems. Initially, the sensors did not detect a clear target. The sky ahead appeared empty through the forward-looking infrared display. The pilots adjusted settings, scanning different altitude ranges and distances. After several moments, a heat signature appeared on the infrared display. The object did not resemble a conventional aircraft. There were no visible exhaust plumes. No clear signs of propulsion. The thermal contrast was minimal, suggesting it was not producing significant heat relative to the surrounding environment. The pilots locked the infrared system onto the object. Once locked, the sensor tracked the object as it moved laterally across the display. The movement was smooth. The object maintained a consistent shape and did not break apart or change form. The pilots recorded the footage. Throughout this phase, radio communication remained calm and descriptive. The pilots narrated what they were seeing on their displays. Radar controllers provided updates on altitude and position when available. At one point, the infrared display showed the object accelerating out of the tracking frame. The lock was lost. The pilots attempted to reacquire the target, adjusting sensor parameters and scanning the surrounding area. The object did not reappear within sensor range. The recording continued for a short period after the loss of contact to ensure that any reappearance would be captured. No further visual or infrared contact was made during this flight. The aircraft were instructed to return to the carrier. The recorded infrared footage was preserved. Sensor data logs were saved. Radar logs from the USS Princeton were also retained for review. The second launch had achieved its primary objective. The unidentified object had been captured on infrared video, and for the first time, the event was documented in a form that could be analyzed after the flight. After the second flight concluded, both aircraft returned to the USS Nimitz without incident. Flight recovery operations proceeded normally. The pilots landed, taxied, and secured their aircraft according to standard procedures. No emergency actions were required. From an operational standpoint, the mission ended like any other training flight. Once on deck, the pilots were directed to report for debrief. The debriefing process was routine but thorough. Pilots were asked to provide a chronological account of their observations. They described what they saw visually, what appeared on radar guidance, and what was captured on the infrared system. The focus remained on observable facts. No conclusions were drawn during this initial discussion. The infrared footage recorded during the second launch was transferred from the aircraft's systems for review. Radar logs from the USS Princeton were also compiled. These materials were preserved as part of the standard post-mission documentation process. Personnel reviewing the footage noted several points immediately. The object maintained a consistent shape throughout the recording. There were no visible wings, rotors, or exhaust plumes. The infrared signature did not match known aircraft profiles. Despite this, the object moved with controlled speed and direction. The moment when the object accelerated out of the sensor's tracking frame was documented carefully. Analysts noted that the loss of lock coincided with a rapid change in relative motion between the object and the aircraft. At this stage, no explanation was assigned. The material was categorized as unidentified. This designation did not imply any specific origin. It simply indicated that the available data did not allow for identification based on known systems. The pilots were not instructed to provide interpretations. They were asked to confirm that the footage matched what they observed during flight. They confirmed that it did. The event was now supported by 3 forms of data: radar tracking, visual observation, infrared recording. This combination increased the significance of the incident within the scope of routine reporting, even though no threat had been identified. With documentation complete, the pilots were released from debrief and returned to normal duties. The carrier group continued its training exercise. Operational tempo remained unchanged. The incident, though unusual, had been recorded, logged, and filed according to procedure. At this point, there were no further instructions to pursue the unidentified object. The focus shifted to maintaining readiness and completing the remaining scheduled operations for the day. The encounter was over, but the record of what had occurred on November 14, 2004, was now complete. Following the completion of flight operations and initial reviews, the incident entered the formal reporting phase. All materials associated with the event were handled according to standard U.S. Navy procedures. This included pilot debrief notes, radar logs from the USS Princeton, and the infrared video recorded during the second launch. The incident was classified internally as an unidentified aerial contact. This classification did not indicate a conclusion about the object's origin or intent. It simply reflected that the data collected did not match any known aircraft, drone, or natural phenomenon documented in Navy reference systems at the time. No immediate threat assessment was issued. The object had not approached the carrier group. It had not interfered with flight operations. It had not displayed hostile behavior. As a result, the incident did not trigger emergency response protocols or follow-up intercepts. The strike group command reviewed the reports and determined that no further action was required during the exercise. The carrier group continued its scheduled operations. Training flights resumed according to plan. Radar monitoring remained active, but no similar contacts were detected for the remainder of the day. The documentation was archived. In military operations, archiving does not imply dismissal. It indicates that an event has been recorded accurately and preserved for potential future review. Thousands of reports are archived each year, most of which never require further attention. At the time, this incident was treated no differently. The pilots returned to their regular duties. Radar operators continued monitoring airspace. Command personnel focused on completing the exercise. There were no briefings issued beyond the immediate chain of command. No external agencies were notified. No public statements were made. Outside of those directly involved, very few people were aware that anything unusual had occurred. November 14, 2004, concluded without incident. The encounter had not altered operations, mission objectives, or readiness status. What remained was a record, a set of observations, sensor data, and video, stored within the Navy's reporting system. For years, that record would remain untouched. The event had been documented. The day had ended, and the ocean returned to silence. In the weeks and months that followed November 14, 2004, the incident received no further operational attention. The USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group completed its training exercise and returned to routine deployments. Pilots rotated assignments. Radar operators moved on to new shifts. The documentation related to the unidentified contact remained archived within internal systems. There were no follow-up briefings. No additional tasking was issued to investigate the object. No new instructions were sent to the pilots who had observed it. From an operational standpoint, the event was considered closed. This was not unusual. Military reporting systems are designed to record large volumes of data. Only incidents that present immediate threats, repeat frequently, or produce actionable intelligence typically move beyond initial documentation. The November 14th encounter met none of those criteria at the time. The object had appeared briefly, behaved unpredictably, and then departed. It had not returned during the exercise. It had not approached the ships. It had not interfered with operations. As a result, the event remained categorized as unidentified, without further analysis. For the pilots involved, the encounter became part of their personal experience rather than an active case. They continued flying missions, instructing younger pilots, and carrying out assigned duties. There were no official discussions about the event outside of required reports. Within the broader Navy, there was no centralized system dedicated to collecting and comparing unidentified aerial encounters. Reports were handled locally and stored individually. Patterns, if they existed, were difficult to identify. The lack of attention did not mean the data was dismissed. It simply meant there was no mechanism at the time to revisit incidents that did not present immediate operational concerns. Years passed. During that time, the archived records remained unchanged. Radar logs stayed in storage. The infrared video was retained, but not widely reviewed. The pilots did not speak publicly about the encounter. There was no expectation that the incident would resurface. It was one documented event among many. And for more than a decade, it remained exactly that. In 2017, the incident from November 14, 2004, resurfaced. That year, a series of reports brought renewed attention to previously archived military encounters involving unidentified aerial phenomena. Among them was the event involving the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group. For the first time, details of the 2004 encounter were discussed outside internal military channels. The renewed attention did not originate from a single source within the Navy. Instead, it emerged as part of a broader review of historical cases involving unidentified aerial contacts. Documents, pilot accounts, and sensor recordings that had remained largely untouched for years were re-examined. The infrared footage recorded during the second launch was included in this review. The video showed a small, distant object tracked by an infrared targeting system. The recording included on-screen telemetry, such as range, angle, and sensor mode. Although the footage was brief, it provided measurable data that could be analyzed independently. The U.S. Department of Defense later confirmed that the footage was authentic and had been recorded by Navy aircraft. This confirmation was significant. It established that the video was not a simulation, not altered, and not misattributed. It was a genuine recording produced during a real military operation. Alongside the video, accounts from the pilots involved were reviewed. Their statements were consistent with the original reports filed in 2004. The descriptions of the object, its movement, and its disappearance matched what had been documented at the time. No new conclusions were added. The review did not identify the object. It did not assign an origin. It did not attribute the encounter to any known technology or foreign system. What it did confirm was that the incident had occurred as reported. The event was now being referred to using a different term. Rather than UFO, official language increasingly used UAP, or unidentified aerial phenomena. The change reflected an effort to remove speculation and focus strictly on observable data. As information about the case became public, interest grew. The encounter was no longer just an archived report. It had become part of a larger discussion about how the military records and evaluates unidentified objects in controlled airspace. For those directly involved in the original event, the reappearance of the record was unexpected. What had once been a routine report, filed and forgotten, was now being examined again. Not because new evidence had emerged, but because the original evidence was finally being seen. After the 2017 reports brought the incident into wider discussion, the U.S. Department of Defense addressed questions about the material. Officials confirmed that the infrared video associated with the USS Nimitz encounter was recorded by Navy aircraft during a real operation. The confirmation did not include an explanation of what the object was. It simply verified the authenticity of the footage. This distinction was deliberate. The confirmation focused on what could be verified, not on speculation. The object remained unidentified. No additional data was released that could resolve its origin or purpose. The Navy also acknowledged that its pilots had encountered objects they could not immediately identify. These statements aligned with the records from November 14, 2004. No corrections were issued to the original reports. The descriptions provided by the pilots remained unchanged. The radar data remained consistent with earlier logs. The video footage remained the same. Public confirmation did not alter the facts of the event. It only brought them into view. At this stage, the encounter was no longer an internal record. It had entered the public domain as a documented incident involving trained military personnel and multiple sensor systems. Despite increased attention, no further conclusions were drawn by official sources. The object was not identified as foreign technology. It was not identified as experimental equipment. It was not identified as a natural phenomenon. It remained classified only as unidentified. For the Navy, this designation was sufficient. The role of military reporting is to document encounters accurately, not to determine origins beyond available evidence. The public discussion continued. The record did not change. The event from November 14, 2004, remained exactly as it had been documented on that day. A series of observations, supported by data, without a confirmed explanation. With the event now publicly acknowledged, attention turned to the data itself. The radar logs indicated objects appearing at high altitude and descending rapidly. The visual observations confirmed the presence of a white, oblong object with no visible control surfaces. The infrared footage showed a heat signature that did not resemble conventional aircraft propulsion. Each data source supported the others in limited but important ways. Radar provided position and altitude. Visual observation confirmed shape and movement. Infrared recording captured relative motion and thermal characteristics. At the same time, each data source had limitations. Radar does not show shape. Visual observation can be affected by distance and perspective. Infrared systems display temperature differences, not physical structure. Because of these limits, The data could not be used to determine what the object was, only what it did. The object demonstrated controlled movement. It changed altitude rapidly. It accelerated without visible propulsion. These observations were documented without interpretation. No evidence indicated that the object was piloted. No evidence indicated that it was autonomous. No evidence indicated intent. The data did not suggest a threat. It did not suggest surveillance. It did not suggest communication. It suggested only that an object was present, observed, and then gone. This lack of resolution was not unusual in aviation reporting. Many encounters remain unexplained due to incomplete data. What made this case different was the combination of trained observers, multiple sensors, and preserved records. Still, the data stopped where it stopped. No additional measurements existed beyond what was recorded on that day. As discussion continued, official language became more precise. The term unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, replaced UFO in many reports. The change reflected a shift toward neutral terminology focused on observation rather than assumption. UAP did not imply extraterrestrial origin. It did not imply advanced technology. It indicated only that an object had been observed and not identified. This terminology applied directly to the USS Nimitz incident. The Navy emphasized that unidentified does not mean unknown forever. It means unknown at the time of observation, given the available data. In this case, the available data was limited to radar, visual contact, and infrared footage from a single day. No debris was recovered. No repeated contact occurred. No further sensor data was collected. As a result, no conclusion could be reached. The Navy's position remained consistent. The encounter was real, documented, and unexplained. That position did not change with time. When the pilots involved spoke publicly years later, their descriptions matched the original records. They described a white object with no wings or exhaust. They described rapid movement and sudden acceleration. They described losing contact without warning. Their accounts did not expand beyond what they had observed. They did not claim knowledge of what the object was. They did not suggest intent or origin. They did not revise their statements. The consistency of their accounts over time became part of the public discussion. However, consistency alone did not produce answers. The pilot's role had been to observe and report. They had done so. Beyond that, they had no additional information. Despite increased attention, the USS Nimitz encounter remained unresolved. No additional data emerged that could explain the object's behavior. No new analysis altered the original conclusions. No official explanation was issued. The event stood as a documented case of an unidentified aerial phenomenon observed by military personnel. It did not lead to policy changes at the time it occurred. It did not alter operations during the exercise. It did not disrupt missions. It existed as a record. Looking back, the encounter on November 14, 2004, remains defined by its boundaries. It occurred within a single day. It involved a limited number of observers. It produced a finite set of data. Nothing before that day predicted it. Nothing after that day resolved it. The record contains no missing pages. It begins with a radar contact. It includes visual observation and infrared recording. It ends with archiving. Everything that is known comes from that sequence. The USS Nimitz incident is not a mystery because it lacks documentation. It is a mystery because the documentation ends without explanation. The record does not speculate. It does not conclude. It does not assign meaning. It simply exists. A single day, a set of observations, Data recorded and preserved. The ocean returned to normal. Flight operations continued. The sky showed no further anomalies. What remains is a factual account of what was observed on November 14, 2004. Nothing more. Nothing less. And that is where the record ends.